Hi, everybody. It's Mike from Here, the Watchmen. And today on the show, we're going to talk about the deep state. And I have an expert with me. His name is Hugo Feugen. And, we're talking to Hugo for the very first time. He has a wealth of knowledge. We're going to do a series of shows with him so we can get everything that he has to say out. The man has an incredible background. I'm going to tell you about that in just a second. His website is thefuddyhoax.com, Fuddy hoax, HOAX.com. He wrote a book by the same name, The Fuddy Hoax, and we're going to talk about that. But I want to let you know that Hugo has been a CEO of 3 different aviation companies or aviation-related companies. He's just amazing. The guy sold one of the aviation simulator companies to Microsoft, and it was one of their most successful aviation simulator ventures ever. I mean, so the guy knows what he's talking about, and I really want you to pay attention to what he has to say today. Hugo, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, Hugo, I mean, let's dive right into this, okay? To start out with, we see that there's evidence that clearly shows that the deep state is involved in a mission of deception, especially since 12/11/2013. Talk to us about that, and let's get your views on what's really going on.
Well, on 12/11/13, we see a very unusual circumstance. That is, a high state official is claimed to have passed away in this aircraft crash off a very secluded peninsula in Hawaii that is off Molokai. There's a peninsula on the northern side of Molokai called Kalaupapa, and a small commuter airline lost one of its Cessna Grand Caravans into the water shortly, or not too far offshore. And this person, or all the people that were on board, 8 passengers and the pilot, went into the water, survived at least for a time, and then this one health official was said to have passed away apparently from an acute arrhythmia, which is, of course, impossible to determine after the fact, at least with any reliability. But nonetheless, that it was the claim. So what we see is there's a lot of evidence that we've been able to look at that shows that there were a lot of false things going on. That is, there were the agencies that were involved, and you could list quite a few. For example, the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Navy, the Maui County Fire Department and Police, the Hawaii state officials, the FAA, the NTSB. All of these groups manifest evidence that we've been able to collect that show they were rife with telling lies and falsifying the evidence. And that's just amazing. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. It's not like when you say there's governmental corruption and somebody has a bank account that swells over in the Bahamas or something. This is huge by comparison. It's an interagency coordinated effort of a scale that is just beyond what anyone normally would imagine. So we're looking at real evidence. We're not making conjectures about, well, I think there was a conspiracy or anything like that. Everything that we've come to has been as a result of looking at real hard evidence. And by the way, there's one small thing. We had talked about bringing on somebody else as well. W, do you remember that? Were we going to do that?
I can try and get him right now. Go ahead and continue.
Well, yeah,
I'll try and send him.
Very good. Anyway, in this particular event, we see that there's a lot of government classified material and personnel involved. And all of that, of course, was hidden from us, but we've been able to discern that through proof, through the evidence, through the videos, through the photographs. We see that there's military involved in this particular event, and the government putting forth a militarized event that is a hoax is just off the charts incredible in terms of what the government is willing to do to use not only the military, but classified pieces of hardware, classified things that get seen in video, which are our country's classified assets that should never be seen. In fact, well, we think one of the conjectures, I'll admit there's a few conjectures in there, but who exactly was involved, whether it was active military or contractors or things like that. That is, we see possibly contractors involved with allowing classified material from our military to be seen on video. Well, someone's calling, that's not you. Okay. Anyway, so there are a number of pieces of hardware that get seen in the video and in photographs. And that's part of this multi-agency coordinated event. But we also see evidence from, for example, the pilot who has told many lies throughout this. And we see the NTSB, which is supposed to investigate all of that, and they're not doing it properly. They're ignoring evidence. They're looking at evidence saying it was this, but it was really that. They're saying the evidence would suggest this, and in fact, the evidence suggests that kind of thing. We see them actually falsifying evidence as well. The images, we see in images from the NTSB, we see that they've been photoshopped, and we see audio that's been changed in the NTSB evidence. So this is really serious stuff. But it doesn't end there with multi-agency collusion. We see all the passengers are in on this particular exercise. They do things to cover up what went on. We see them telling falsehoods. We see other people related to the incident also willing to tell falsehoods. And we see post-activity, post-event cover-up as well from multiple agencies. We see it from the FAA, we see it from the NTSB, we see it from the Maui County Police, we see it from the Maui County Fire Department, we see it from the Hawaii County, or from the Hawaii State agencies. So it's just so rife with inappropriate behavior. I'm not a lawyer to say it's all criminal, blah, 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 but it's clearly goes right to the top in terms of who could have possibly coordinated these activities. So it's just a really big event that needs to be publicized and investigated fully. There's a certain amount that we've been able to do from the outside as citizen investigators, if you will. But thus far, no official agency has investigated this. That is, there was a claimed death, as we've said. So why didn't the, if it was a planned event and someone died, that's called a murder. And so why was this not investigated by the local county authorities, Maui County? If there's that kind of a thing, it should be at least considered as a possible murder. And yet no investigation in that vein went on at all. So those just all kinds of investigation that has not yet taken place, which I'm confident would show these falsehoods, these cover-ups, these things that have been done very inappropriately. There was a claimed catastrophic engine failure, for example, of the airplane, and yet on the recording we hear a smoothly running engine. We hear its RPM going up and we hear the RPM going down, but the pilot had said it stopped. It clearly did not stop until it hit the water. We've got that on recording as well. It winds down and stops only then. So people have been telling falsehoods left and right. And so All of that needs to be with the evidence in hand. And as I've suggested in multiple comments there, the NTSB has turned in a completely false investigation and report. And that needs to be corrected. I mean, we can't have airplanes and whatever falling out of the sky. The investigation that the NTSB put out, their report, suggested that the problem lay with the engine and its manufacturer or whatever. And they, via the FAA, slapped the airframe and engine with what they call airworthiness directives, which are changes in maintenance and activity to support that engine, which clearly hurt the manufacturer of the engine, the manufacturer of the airframe, and all of the shareholders and customers of those planes, when in fact there was no problem with that airplane at all. It was all falsehoods and claimed to be so. So these people may have some kind of claim against what was said and done there. And even though the airworthiness directives I mentioned were not solely on this particular crash, involved in the weight and burden of evidence of many other events as well. But nonetheless, this was a very high profile event in which a person died and everybody knew about this. So it probably had some sway in that determination. Indeed, the FAA was part of the determination that there was this big failure with that particular engine when there was not. So they participated in that false conclusion, which I'll have to qualify and say they were presented with false evidence. So the conclusion is not necessarily due to their malfeasance in that particular case. But the NTSB, however, did know of this inappropriate claim of the engine failure when it was not truly an engine failure. Anyway, where would you like to go?
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated, Hugo, with what you're saying. But let's take a look at, if we could, what is behind all this? Why is the deep state doing this? What is their motivations? What do they really want to do to all of us?
Well, we can easily make some conjectures, if you will, but I'll do that only on the basis of evidence, of fact that we have. And that is, this person who was claimed to have died, we know through this investigative process that that person did not die. That is, they were replaced in the scenario with another person. And that person took the place in the video of the original person. Is obviously very different body type, very different shoes, very different hair. I mean, they were just this person. The replacement was disguised to be the Hawaii Health Department director. So why would you do that? Well, we can see that the health director of Hawaii, who was only in office for a fairly short time, who probably didn't have the credentials that previous health department directors did. That is, this person did not have a medical degree. So was put into place a little unusually by Governor Abercrombie, who was newly elected back in 2009. And very shortly thereafter, this non-medical degreed person who has a very long history of, for example, being associated with a group that, for example, is part of the CIA, becomes part of the director, or becomes the director of the Health Department of Hawaii. And that person proceeds to find something that the governor said he could not find. That is a birth certificate for the President of the United States. And Governor Abercrombie was unable to find it, said he looked high and low in all the government things, used his search warrants to be able to go into various places, and it was unable to do that. So anyway, he subsequently appoints this person, Loretta Fuddy, as the director, and voila, within 3 months, there's a presentation at the White House of the president's birth certificate, supposedly. Now, that was panned by lots of people, lots of experts, document experts looking at that, said there's all kinds of problems with it. And we agree that there are indeed all kinds of problems, and they've not put that on public display, the original of that, either of the two supposed originals. But anyway, shortly after his presentation, there were all kinds of people saying that's not right. It's clearly a forgery, clearly a fraud. But that was the moment that the president chose to make this huge presentation in front of the White House Correspondents' Dinner and roast this person who had been making claims or asking the president for his birth certificate. So why won't he show his birth certificate? Well, that was one Donald Trump back in 2012. In early 2012, he was asking such questions, and he was present at the White House Correspondents' Dinner just a few days after the presentation of this newly found birth certificate that Loretta Fuddy had provided. And it was a huge presentation that the president did at that dinner. And it was, you'd have to say, most embarrassing to be singled out as Donald Trump was. Now, that was on the basis of fraudulent documentation. So what President Obama was doing at that time was entirely inappropriate, of course, because his documentation was fraudulent. But he made it appear to the fullest height of appropriateness and used that occasion to put Donald Trump under thumb, in my opinion. He sat there as the camera panned to him many times during Obama's presentation. He was absolutely stoic and silent and was being roasted. So, you know, people were talking at that time that Donald Trump might enter the race. He's a presidential candidate. He's whatever. But anyway, it was not too long after that Donald Trump was a confession, if you will, on the basis, again, of false documentation, asked to support whether he believed that Barack Obama was born in Hawaii. And Donald Trump acquiesced and said, yes, he believed he was born in Hawaii. But anyway, maybe with that, the air was let out of the balloon for a Donald Trump 2012 presidential bid that if it came to pass only 4 years later, but how different would the world have been if we had seen the Donald Trump in 2012? But Obama was able to put a quash on that. And even though the headlines of the newspapers and so forth were filled with people saying that this birth certificate was had all kinds of problems and was likely a forgery, it turns out that President Obama also used that occasion within 5 days of the presentation to play the Osama bin Laden card, even though we reportedly knew maybe up to a year ahead of that time where Osama bin Laden was, and we had good intelligence from the Pakistani intelligence service and so forth. Barack Obama used that occasion to wipe any headlines of birth certificate and replace it with the capture and killing, or I should say killing, of Osama bin Laden, and shortly thereafter a supposed burial at sea. Anyway, that of course did the magic of getting rid of the birth certificate from any news outlet, as it was overshadowed by this other event that was chosen to be put in the news by the president at that time. So anyway, there's a little more. Where would you like to go as a result of that?
Well, I'll tell you what, Hugo, we've got W who has joined us on the call. He's coming in on audio here. W, are you there?
I sure am.
Oh, very good.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today, W. I think you've heard some of what we were talking about here, and the question that I proposed to Hugo was we talked earlier about the issue, the incidents that happened in Hawaii, and the question that I asked Hugo was, what is behind the deep state and their motivation? What are they really trying to do to us? Can you share on that?
Well, let me approach it from just a slightly different angle and get to that answer through one or two steps. First off, how did Donald Trump end up becoming the president? I believe after the incidents that Hugo explained just now, and based on my own experiences and contacts that were occurring during this period of time, that in 2013, members of the military, former and present, very senior military persons, approached Trump and presented him with the problem that essentially we were a captured operation, and that those persons involved had control of our government and were a threat to national security, and that they would back Trump if Trump would go for the presidency in order to try to recapture the flag, if you will. And I believe that that's precisely what happened, that Trump did in fact run and did get support from those folks. And after gaining the election victory, that Trump was very careful. He distanced himself from the Secret Service and the classic institutions and saddled up with the military intelligence groups and military personnel with the understanding that essentially they were fighting a prior coup, and that this was a very dangerous moment. And one of the things that Trump did, of course, he did the Twitter accounts that we're all very aware of, but at some point had to bypass the regular media routes and still have a way to back his supporters, help them to understand what was being said, and have some level of plausible deniability. And so back in October, we had a phenomena that came on the stage, the Q drops. And this was supposedly an insider with Q clearance who was giving us insights to the actions of the president and his directions at tent, etc. Those Q drops increased in complexity and in number over the last few months, and have become very critical to what's going on in pushing the American psyche, electorate, supporters, helping to understand what's going on behind the scenes. We know, based on coordination of these Q intelligence insider information drops, that the president has authorized this and is a participant in this, and that the Q personnel, it's not just one person, are providing some level of direction and insight to the national conversation behind the scenes. If you're not following the Q stuff, then you need to. There's plenty of sites out there to go look at the Q stuff and to come up to speed on it. Now, the reason I raise all of that is because we have a deep state that is essentially those persons who are, for the most part, unelected, that are in charge of running our country, that exist between administrations, that go beyond administrations. And those personnel, federal employees, state employees, etc., they don't go away no matter who the next person is selected, and they're backing each other up, have essentially captured government operations. And they're in the judiciary, they're in the attorney general's office, they're in the treasury, they're in all these various agencies that have the potential to hurt or affect the way that the president is able to govern. So how would you attack the deep state? How would you go after them? How would you try to dislodge them? And essentially what we've seen and what's being said is that because a military coup has essentially taken place, and going back to the Feugen incident, military assets, including nuclear submarine, were used to pull off this death ruse, let alone all of the state and federal agencies that were involved both in the creation and dissemination of the birth certificate itself, and then in the cover-up. How would you fight that? How would you dislodge that? If there's corruption in the FBI, if there's corruption in the various other federal agencies and three-letter agencies and in the judiciary, well, the only option that really could apply here is both military investigation and then military tribunals. And that's exactly what the Q group is implying. Guantanamo has been revamped and expanded, and there have been not just hints, but assertions that we are being prepared for some type of arrests, and then a military investigation, prosecution of persons involved in this coup against America, including and up to the elections. Forget the Russians. If you have deep state people who are getting their candidate in place using the power of their federal positions, their jobs, and state and local also, how can an outside candidate fight that? And so while we may have gotten a win this time with Trump getting into office, these deep staters, if they get their way, would never allow that to happen again. And they didn't think it could happen last time. They figured that Hillary had to win. But that's the context of all of our conversations now. Was there a ruse on the birth certificate? Of course. Was there use of military assets and arm twisting of all the various agencies that would be involved in order to pull off this death ruse plane crash with Buddy? Of course. We can prove that. That's beyond contention in reality as far as I'm concerned at this point in time. So the only real question that faces us is how do we as a nation address this corruption and get control of our government back to we the people. And probably the only venue at this point that can be played, that can work, that wouldn't end up just being a O.J. Simpson trial, is military tribunals, military backed investigation. And that's what the Q group represents, is a military intelligence operation that is giving us a backdoor, bypassing the regular media. You get to be a fly on the wall, what Trump is thinking and doing in order to go after the deep state and dismantle it, drain the swamp, if you will, and get control back to the electorate of our federal government.
Wow. I mean, that takes us down a whole nother path. Let's go back to Hugo. Hugo, what are your thoughts on what W just disclosed there?
Well, that's obviously the big backdrop of all of this. And we get there in part by doing the detailed work. As I think W alluded, This is beyond contention. We have sufficient facts. We have a lot of facts that show not just a few things were done falsely, but that there was coordination among so many different agencies, and so many people were telling falsehoods and taking actions that were obviously influenced. All of that needs to be settled out, investigated, written down, brought to trial, as it were, and begin to dismantle this deep state that has actually sat above all these concerns and had such tremendous influence against the interests of the citizens of this country. That is, we have lost the grip of our government by the citizenry. That has to change. We have to get that back, or we're just done. And these mechanisms have to have traction. They have to get a toehold. They need to come to fruition with clear evidence, not just something that can be subjected to and demagogued by people who said, well, people are just trying to do this, and conspiracy theorists that. All of that, that's undeserving for what this represents. That is, we have taken the appropriate approach of clear investigation on the merits of evidence, and that needs to be all brought to light so that this book can be written and closed, and we can get on to making sure that none of these people who have been involved in this kind of corruption ever see the halls of government again. And that's a huge task, and I'm just so thankful that this president is willing and has found mechanisms to be able to make that happen. That's what we've needed, and that's where we're headed.
Well, and let me add this, Mike, for your listeners. You have to think what was in play here, what was so critical from a deep state perspective that you had to have Obama in the presidency or Hillary in the presidency. Why did they have to win? Because, and this goes back to why military tribunals are probably the only answer that can be made to work at this point in time and are applicable. Because what was it that was the pursuit of Obama during both terms of his administration, and especially the second term? Well, of course, the push to start a war in Syria, the Arab Spring, which was a complete concoction between CIA and State Department, the unlawful running of guns, the unlawful occupation and takedown of Gaddafi, violation of international law. People can argue that if they want, but the reality is that that was an illegal action on our part. If any other country had done it, we'd be screaming bloody murder. But we're the big guy on the block. My country, right or wrong? No, I'm not in that mode. These are putting us in a situation now where we have mucked up things enough in the Mideast and thrown the balance off far enough that most likely the only alternative for us, including for this presidency, is some type of much more involved military action now in the Mideast. We're getting set up for another war. Well, who put us in that position? Who exacerbated the problems that were already there? And that goes back to this last administration and the deep state. President Obama didn't do this by himself. This was a far wider operation. He was just the figurehead for something much deeper, much more extensive. He couldn't have pulled this off by himself. So to make Obama the bad guy or Hillary the bad person is missing the point. The number of people and groups who were seeking to benefit by getting the United States into a protracted and very extensive military conflict in the Mideast, the lives that were on the line and are still, we could lose many thousands of personnel in that region in this fight that's coming, that's a result of the takedown of Syria. And to say that it was just insurgents inside Syria that wanted to do that, well, you could say that about, a half a dozen, 2 dozen, 5 dozen groups here in the U.S. that if some foreign power came in and wanted to back some supremacy group or patriot group or some, BS, you could say it was a legitimate revolution. And that we'd fight that and say that's not true. That's not representative of the country. Well, you could say that was the case with Syria. And for Christians, your audience, excuse me, the most protected and now persecuted group in Syria is Christians. Assad was protecting the Christians in his country, and so was Gaddafi. Those groups have now been singled out in both countries for attack. So this is a very personal thing, especially for your audience. And when you realize the horrors that were brought on some of these communities that were very real, it's very disturbing. Also, the creation by CIA and other deep state parties and backing, including with State Department personnel, of ISIS. ISIS didn't come from nowhere, and it wasn't something that existed prior to U.S. involvement, U.S. backing to fund, provide military assets to that group. So when we say we're fighting ISIS, that was a creation, a fabrication of our intelligence agencies and State Department and funds. So what are we as citizens, what's being done in our name, with our assets, with our tax dollars, and what responsibility as American citizens, what role have we played by not keeping our government under control? What's being done in our name that we cannot conscience? And what are you going to do about it?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that out, W. I appreciate that because, I think within the Christian community, we need to wake up. And that's why I'm so excited to have both of you on the show today. Unfortunately, we're running short on time here. So I want to have you guys back for part 2 of this series next week, and I'll communicate with both of you, and we'll reach out a time. I think we need to get more into what W you just said, which is almost, it's one thing to say become awake. It's another to have a plan for how to become awake and what to do. Hugo, I did want to point out that to the audience that you have a book that you have written, The Fuddy Hoax. Give me a short synopsis of what that is and where people can find the book.
Our website is www.thefuddyhoax.com. The Fuddy Hoax, just written together without spaces.com. And there you'll find several media samples that describe a lot of what we've done here. We've been on various radio interviews and so forth. And you can, of course, order the book either in physical form, which is a 415-page large format book that lies flat on a coffee table, for example. It has hundreds and hundreds of color photos that incorporate images from the NTSB evidence and the media evidence that was contemporaneous with the event and things that happened shortly thereafter. Everything is laid out in excruciating detail. Hopefully it's easy to navigate that, and there's nice summaries of various things. But you can get that there. The electronic version, which you can get via the internet, is $19.95, and the physical form we send you in the mail, and that's $39.95.
And let me add one thing real quickly, Mike, and that is people say, well, this is old history. It's way back in the past, and we're on to new stuff. And why do I want to fight this last battle? Let me just say this. The investigation, this is a court-ready presentation. We're ready to go to court right now with real stuff. The investigation that would be done by whatever agency would come in, or agencies, is essentially just plug and play. They would just duplicate what we've done and have access possibly to documents at these agencies. But the reason this is important right now, while there's questions of, what's gone on at the DNC and Hillary and other activities with Obama that would require very extensive investigations, could take years. The reality is this is court ready now, and it's very specific to an individual rather than being broad based and who could possibly have done the Russian collusion, etc. And it's hundreds and hundreds of people. This is very precise. All of this was done to protect one person in the presidency. And so unlike these other investigations that could be done that would take years to develop, this is very precise and can be done very quickly. We know exactly where to go for much of the documentation, who needs to be talked to beyond the documentation that we already have. And this could be done very, very quickly, and it's very precise. You want to talk about election fraud, we've got it right here. And it's far more personal, far more devastating to us as a country, because the people involved weren't some foreign power way far away. They were people within our own government, and it's a very rapid route to court, even if it's a military court, to make this happen. And we would get to the same players. The people that were involved in this most recent thing involving the Russian collusion, et cetera, all the same players are involved in this one, but the investigative work is far more extensive and more developed and court ready, unlike anything else that would come. You want to get results right away? This is where it happens. And we get the same players and activities as what's gone on more recently, trying to go after Trump in the presidency right now.
Well, thank you for that, W. Now, I want to thank you guys both for joining us today here on the Watchmen's Report. And I also want to thank the both of you for the dedication you each have to bringing out the truth. And I know you put a lot of work in there, and I know, like the rest of us, we all get called nutcases at times for the things that we talk about and look into. I did want to also mention before we sign off here, folks, that people have been asking about QAnon. I'm going to put a link down in the description here. Jerome Corsi says that you can go to QAnon post at that link, and you can follow that if you so choose. And guys, I want you to stay with me, if you will, after I sign off here in a second. Again, thank you, because we want to set up the part 2 of this if we can now. It's so important, the information you guys are disclosing. So W, again, thank you. Hugo, again, thank you. Folks, until the next time we see you here on the Watchmen's Report, do your research, stay informed, and don't forget, you can do anything with Jesus in your heart except nothing at all. God bless each and every one of you. We'll see you again next time here on the Watchmen's Report.